Welcome back to Now in Zen. Today we have Taylor Brook and John Schneider here to talk about a piece called One-Footed Bride. So Del Sol Quartet, Partch Ensemble. And is there a third party I don't know about?
Yeah, the spirit of Harry Partch and the Canada Arts Council generous grant. Those are all the different parties involved. But yes, it
Yeah.
was it was Del Sol Quartet functioning as soloists really, and Partch Ensemble as kind of orchestra with them.
Yeah, I could tell that that was kind of the framing for how it was written. It had such a nice focus on the string quartet. Taylor, did you draw any inspiration from Harry Partch's style when you were writing? Are there certain things about the piece that you would think come from him or ideas that were inspired?
Yeah, absolutely. This question is a really good one because it points to like a huge issue that I think everyone faces if they write for Partch's instruments. Of course, you don't want to sound like an imitation of Partch, but these instruments are designed to convey his music and his style, his tuning system. They're embedded within how these instruments are constructed, how they look, everything about them. So there's no better way to use these instruments than the way Partch used them. If we want to talk about idiomatic writing, right? And so you can fight against that. You could maybe sort of wrap around and come at it from a different angle, which is part of what my strategy was. But then you also have to deal with Partch's influence for a piece like this because it's so directly inspired by Harry Partch's idea of the one-footed bride, which is basically, I'm sure many of your listeners know what the one-footed bride is, but it's a diagram from Genesis of a Music, Harry Partch's book, which basically charts out interval regions and attaches sort of emotive characteristics to them. So you have they all sort of just make sort of intuitive sense, at least to me. And I think, if there's such a thing as sort of like a universal way of hearing an interval, it kind of tries to capture that. So you have power, yeah, there it is on screen. So you have power at the unison in the fifth. You have suspense in the tritone region. You
Mm.
have emotion in the thirds and sixths. So it's also symmetrical on either side. And the
Oh, I
sevenths and
get it.
seconds, yeah, the seconds and sevenths are approach, right? A leading tone, right? Is approach. So I wanted to take that idea and run with it, try to sort of focus on that. And another very important way in which I included Harry Partch as an inspiration for this piece was I used Partch's scale. And I
Yeah.
used Partch's scale in, I think, the way that he usually uses it, which is that sometimes he doesn't use it, as in sometimes things slide, and sometimes there's a harmony that's not in the scale. Sometimes you want to have a fifth above a certain interval that isn't in the scale because it's technically not in the 11 limit and it's not in the sort of filler intervals that you put in there. And so I try to approach the scale and the way he uses a part scale in a similar way. So those ways it was similar. The ways that I tried to fight against it were, a lot of it had to do with orchestration, and a lot of it had to do with how sort of narrative and form, and like sort of things not related to pitch and not related to instrument, but just how the piece was constructed. I didn't try to avoid any kind of stylistic markers, right?
Mm.
So Harry Partch, he was trying to really make his own style. It seemed to me he was trying to make his own style, and he did a very good job at that. And I'm more making a sort of a mix and match out of many styles. It's a rich question, so I could go on, but I'll leave it there, I think.
You know, when I first spoke to Charles Corey, I was shocked at how many notes of the 43 tone scale are left out of particular instruments. What instruments were used for this piece? It wasn't all of the Partch instruments, right? It was maybe like seven or eight of them.
Well, it was something about 12, and I think John can probably speak to um, these particular instruments better than I can, but I tended to gravitate towards one that conveyed the pitches really clearly and also could sort of work together because, as you mentioned, most of his instruments don't include all the notes. I mean, the bass marimba all includes a small subsection of them.
Diamond marimba, there's huge holes in it in terms of where, because it's triadic. It's not a melodic instrument. It's a harmonic instrument. The same thing with the kitharas. Those are harmonic harps, not melodic harps. So to actually try to play a melody, it's a lot of work. You'd have to go this string and this hexad, this string and this string and this string and this string. It's a nightmare. Well, I mean, Taylor nailed it. The whole point is he was making those instruments to articulate the music that he was hearing in his head. And once he made the instruments told him what they could do. Because he would improvise on them, find something he liked, write it down, and then start molding those materials. So the instruments themselves, I'm just calling up the score right now. There were harmonic cannons, to say the least, which are, so it was for adapted guitar 3 or adapted guitar 1, depending which way you look at it. That crazy guitar that's all one note, 6 versions of a guitar's G string, all at the same
Oh,
time.
that one.
Oh, that one. Yeah, exactly. And there was adapted guitar 2, which is the 10-string slide. They're both slide guitars. Bass marimba, cloud chamber bowls, diamond marimba. We used 2 harmonic cannons. There was the kithara, the spoils of war, the surrogate kithara, and the chromelodion. That's a big bite out of that's at least half the instruments right there.
And certainly a preference towards stringed instruments there.
Hmm.
Among those, I'm a guitarist. I mean, I'm not really a guitarist. I play guitar. So I think that was one attraction to it. One thing I wanted to bring out, because the piece was about the one-footed bride, was I wanted to make the harmony really clear. And in a lot of Partch's music, it's not actually about having full harmonies that are really resonant and sustained. It's kind of percussion music a lot of the time. And so I actually, John very nicely helped me figure this out, but bowing a lot of these stringed instruments in a way that I don't think had been done before. I mean, people have bowed guitars before, but we bowed all the instruments that had strings on them, and we bowed the chamber glass chamber bowls as well to create sort of a more sustained sound. But yeah, that's the instrumentation. It's quite a lot of Partch's instruments, but not all of them.
The idea of extended techniques on the Partch instruments makes me giddy.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
it's all open, right? So any technique is an extended technique on it, or rather, extended
Truly.
techniques aren't looked at side-eyed.
what I find personally just fascinating, and I'm sure your listeners will also want to know from Taylor, how the hell did you know so much about Partch's instruments? And the secret is that Taylor's PhD was mostly on the Partch instruments. He knows them backwards, forwards, upside down, any which way, because he's done the homework, years of research, which is, for me, it was such a dream. People say to me, "Oh, I'd love to write for the instruments." I said, "Oh, great, that's fine, that's fine." Do you have any idea what you're taking on here? Because you have to figure out what they are, how to notate the music, the notes you can't use, the notes you can use, et cetera, et cetera. And each instrument has its own playing technique. I mean, I've never really asked Taylor this, but I mean, you just seem to do it effortlessly.
Well, I wouldn't say it was effortlessly, but
There was a lot of effort, but it was
it
behind the
was a lot of
scenes.
effort. I think it worked well. The research I did on Partch is what made the piece possible to write. Basically my training and learning how to write for these instruments was that among a couple other pieces, I looked at large sections of Delusion of the Fury by Harry Partch for my doctoral thesis. The score is all tablature, right? Because, tablature performance instructions, you don't even know for half the instruments what note you're going to hear when you look at the notation. And so I transposed it, and or not transposed it, transcribed it. I transcribed not the entire Delusion of the Fury, but the entire introductory section, the Exordium, and bits and pieces from elsewhere. And through that, and by the way, you mentioned Charles Corey earlier. I corresponded with him, got a lot of tips from him, because it's not always clear in the front matter of the score, where Partch describes how the instruments are notated. It's not 100% clear all the time, and so I got a bit of his help. I got help from a little bit, I think, from Mark Sabat as well. But in any case, even after doing that, I still had misconceptions when we came to write this piece, and still had, I mean, at that point they were kind of small errors, but I still had some mistakes because, well, guitar 3, which one's guitar 3? It's guitar 1 here, it's guitar 3 there. In Genesis of a Music, it's by one system. In the scores, it's another system. Each piece, the harmonic canons are tuned radically differently, or I shouldn't say in each, but they're often tuned radically differently. Partch Ensemble has some sort of special instruments, like John, your harmonic canons. In fact, you have some that are made so that you can have a concert that has different pieces where he demands different tunings without taking a 20-minute intermission, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I actually invented an instrument called the Janus or the Janus because it's got strings on both sides, so you can flip it over. I mean, the insane thing is that Harry, whenever he wrote a piece, he was just writing it, and most of the time, he would overdub them himself. So he'd take down all the bridges, retune the strings, and then record a section, and then take them down. And then another piece would be a completely different tuning, completely different bridging. And if we, as modern performers, want to perform 2 of those pieces in the same program, we need 5 or 6. And right now we've got, let me see, I'm having 2 more built now, 2 flippers, Janus ones with 2 sides. So now we virtually have 9 canons.
Wow.
It's just that complicated.
Yeah. And and so even if you really know these instruments, there is still, when you're, I can see why Harry Partch experimented on instruments himself so much, because even when you're writing, quote unquote, normal notation, or the Western notation that I am trained with, there's a level of abstraction there that you have to get past. And when you're writing tablature, you have a second level of abstraction. So it makes everything, I know, it's definitely a challenge.
Which is very ironic, because what's the one thing that Partch hated? Abstract music.
Right.
Not abstraction in music, but literally abstract music. And he rails about it all the time. And here, I mean, this is Taylor having to think through 3 or 4 different hierarchical levels just to get to the actual sound in the room. It's just wild.
I wondered, when I was writing it, I often thought to myself, I don't think Harry Partch would have liked this piece very much. But that didn't, I think that's okay. That's probably good. Or I don't know if it's good. It's neutral.
Well, you remember that famous story that Ben Jonson says that Harry told him, if anybody ever calls me their teacher, or calls themselves my student, I will happily strangle them. He did not want people to get anywhere near to copy him. And that's why he loved Ben so much, because Ben took the ideas and kept going. He made it his own. God forbid,
Right.
we don't need a faux Partch.
Yeah.
I think the style in the One-Footed Bride definitely seems like it's a unique thing, and the textures, they just kind of keep going, but it's not repetitive, but it doesn't feel like things are just rambling on. It like evolves very organically, but very slowly. And then a lot of those evolutions have drone chords that are over a root, but then you're sort of like exploring different microtonal intonations over a drone root. My favorite one was at the end. I think I might know what's going on. Like the one that is a G chord, and then there's the violin player is like playing like 2 tritones, right? And one of them is like almost the normal one, and then one of them is an 11/8.
Yeah. So in Bitter Music, Harry Partch writes, this is not an exact quote, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here for the Partch purists out there. A painter has 10 shades of orange. A composer only has 1 C sharp, right? And and this speaks to the One-Footed Bride, because in each interval region, so the major second, or not even the major second region, but the seconds region, in the 43 notes per octave Partch scale, there are a bunch of different seconds in there. If we want to take the analogy a little further, maybe a composer has 2 shades of a second, right? The minor second, major second, in 12
If they're
tones.
lucky.
Yeah, exactly. So so you have more shades, basically. I mean, I think that's one way of looking at the diatonic superstructure and the microtonal sort of substructure that the the One-Footed Bride conveys, at least to me. And so so yes, I'm often playing with that. And so yeah, you have the violins going this sort of like this tiny little bend down, and I you have a better ear than I. You could probably say more specifically what they were. I don't even remember, but yeah, I think it's 7 to 5 to 11/8. They're sort of like moving between in that section.
It might be instructive also. This is something that the musicians certainly knew, or, well, yeah, because they had access to the score as well as the parts, that the different sections of the pieces, and there are very clearly different sections of the piece, they have titles, they have names that are taken from well, perhaps you could reiterate those, Taylor, because there's power, these are all the words that Partch used to describe the emotional, if you will, the label you can give these particular intervals.
Yeah, so I was very like kind of I wasn't too subtle about what I was trying to do in the piece. So the title is the region of the One-Footed Bride, power, suspense, emotion, approach. And those sections try to bring out the qualities of those interval regions in different ways. And then there's a quote that John says in performance, or rather, he has sort of the speaking part, and there's a quote for each section that kind of introduces it. Some from Harry Partch, and others from sort of famous historical figures: Rosa Luxemburg, W.B. Du Bois, Paulino Oliveros, yes, Alexandro Strigio, who wrote the libretto for Monteverdi's Orfeo. I'm probably forgetting one or two others.
Harry Partch. We got some of Harry's works too.
Yeah, we have a couple Partch quotes in there. And so I wanted the audience to know what I was trying to do as much as possible in it. Not that it sort of makes or breaks a piece, but there was kind of an experiment happening there, or rather like an attempt to almost, I wouldn't want to say scientifically explore it because that's not right, but I was doing this bad thing of telling the audience how they should be understanding the music, basically, and seeing if it worked. Sort of as maybe it's more of a challenge to myself than anything. And because one thing that I really admire about Harry Partch's work is that it does convey a wide range of emotion, and it's something in contemporary music that can be challenging depending on sort of what style you're working in contemporary music, to be able to convey a wide range of emotions, or even sort of address emotions at all. The music's often about other things.
You know, there's a famous animosity between John Cage and Harry Partch. Harry hated the fact that they were always used in the same sentence because they were, I don't know, like mid-century weirdos. And at one point, Harry said, you know, the reason why I get so mad at Cage is because Cage put the whammy on emotion. Which is exactly right. I mean, Cage wanted to stay as far away as possible. He didn't want any manipulation. And Harry is saying, no, that's what music is for heaven's sake. So that's a big difference.
Yeah.
So the sections then, how did you rehearse those? Like, how many rehearsals did it take, this monstrosity of a piece?
Yeah, we did quite a bit of rehearsal. John, I don't know how much you all looked at it before I arrived, but we had a rehearsal period where, we did a few long days, or a couple days with just the Partch instruments, and I was conducting the piece. And so we were able to prepare ahead of the string quartet, and the string quartet Del Sol were extremely well prepared. So they arrived really knowing the piece. And so a lot of the rehearsals were sort of fitting the two together. And it was kind of an intensive rehearsal period, but it's sort of like a few days of many, many hours and really sort of honing in on it.
It was pretty insane, actually, because the Del Sol were in the middle of a tour. They had to leave their tour, fly to LA, work for 3 days, go back on their tour, and then come back, 4 weeks later. And we just had a few days in order to actually nail it. And of course, being in the space is a huge thing too. So, and in the meantime, of course, Taylor's piece was the first half. The second half was this huge undertaking of the full choreography of plectrum percussion dances, and we had to spend a lot of time on that. And
Ooh.
also there was the extra little plus that we had to actually use 3 subs on this show, which is insane because I mean you don't just call like, oh, let's get another violinist. Who
Right,
are you going
yeah.
to call? Who in the hell knows how to play a diamond marimba or a bass marimba or any of that stuff? So that added to the excitement, to say the least.
Indeed.
It was sort of the second project that I did in person since the beginning of the pandemic. And the first one that I was able to be involved in as a musician, as a conductor. And so it was really an intense and really great experience to be able to put it together.
It's such a joy to have the composer conducting because you know he's going to get what he wants, or at least close, or at least try.
Right. Yes.
How did you get most of what you wanted?
I did. Yeah. I mean, the performances I thought were fantastic. And yeah, all the musicians were at an incredibly high level. Yeah, it was really just a very special experience. Yeah, I felt like I was clearly sort of the amateur up there among professional musicians, but it was a lot of fun.
I bet it takes a really long time to study the Partch instruments and get really proficient at them and like make that, your thing as part of the Partch ensemble. It seems almost like, I don't know, if not a lifetime commitment, then definitely like a significant portion of a lifetime.
It's damn close. Famously, Harry moved constantly, and every time he moved, he had to train a new set of musicians. It was just driving him. It drove him crazy, actually. And I got to say, I'm so thrilled. My band, with the exception of 1 or 2 people, it's been the same people playing together for 20 years. That never happens in a
Wow.
chamber. Maybe a string quartet or a piano trio, right? You'll change out a viola player or something like that. But these folks know their instruments, and it's gotten to the point. One of the other joys and terrors of playing in a Partridge band is that you don't just play one instrument. You will often play 2, 3, maybe even more. And it's always fascinating for audiences to watch us because all of a sudden people are standing up and crossing the stage and going to another instrument and playing. It's like, what the hell is going on? Stick to your instruments. No, no, no. We all play all the instruments with small exceptions. I'm not a keyboard player. There's no way. So
Are there any particular just chords, Taylor, that you use that you find to be highly unconventional or really, really microtonal sounding?
Let me think. My approach to pitch in this piece, I had very high level guides, as in I wanted to explore different interval regions according to the One-Footed Bride, and I explored them in terms of, iterating that interval itself. So let's say it's the 5/4 major third, then that is very present in that section. But maybe I'm also exploring using that 5/4 as the perceived tonal center.
Yeah.
So it could be both those things, or in combination, or in contrast. And so, but beyond that kind of like very high level, I know this section is going to be centered on G, this one's going to be on the 5/4, this one's going to be on the 11/8, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond that, my approach to pitch was very intuitive in the piece, very sort of like, excuse me, follow my nose. I mean, there's some exceptions. I made some chord progressions here and there. For instance, in the very first section, which is an approach section, so the whole piece begins with a kind of tonal center fake out,
Yes.
where it's on A, right, and everybody is hitting an A, and then you get small deviations around that, but it's very much centered on A. But the piece is really in G, but you don't get there till the very end because G is the center of the whole Partch, scale. There's a very large section that's based on the slightly flat B of the 5/4, and I think that's probably a section where the chords get sort of the crunchiest because you have the 5/4 being sustained by so many bowed strings in the Partch ensemble, and then the string quartet is kind of moving through harmonies.
Yes.
The piece, to naming specific harmonies is actually kind of hard for me to remember at this point. I would need to go back to the score. Um, but the general principles were those were the general principles, and there was nothing too systematic about it. I wouldn't say there's sort of like a favorite chord it returns to. It was more an idea of playing with the amount of clarity of pitch center. I'd say,
Oh
and
yeah.
I'd say in general, that's kind of my approach to harmony. It's kind of a spectral approach to harmony. So like I had a fifth, I had an octave, I had a major third. That's a major chord, but it's also like the clearest harmony you could have to sort of force in a tonal center. Ignoring any other context you have of what comes before or after it. And so yeah, the piece plays more with that, like how dense, how crunchy, how obvious of a tonal center are the harmonies here or there. If we wanted to sort of go through a section and talk about harmony in more granular detail, I'd be happy to, but I'd have to pull up the score.
Well, let me ask you, Taylor, because if I'm writing for the instruments, I have a chromelodian at my house. I can do that. And you said, oh, you sort of followed your nose or followed your ears. How? Did you tune up a synthesizer?
Actually, no. The only time I used, so I even from a very young age, I shouldn't say that. Since since I was in my early 20s, I would say I've avoided any kind of playback in finale or Sibelius or whatever, and I don't write in front of an instrument either. And so I try to imagine the sound as much as I can, imagine the harmonies. I don't think I have a particularly good ear for it. And so it's a mixture between familiarity, as in I've written using just-intonation for so long that I have a sort of baseline familiarity, and then a kind of a trust in the process. If I know that I want to move through these harmonies and create a certain effect, but I don't know exactly what this particular harmony is going to sound like, I will write it and I'll see what happens. And so there is some guesswork that happens. I did have a 43 notes per octave piano tech patch that I would occasionally feel things out on. I also had the samples you sent me of the cloud chamber bowls,
Yeah.
which was very important for the piece, and one section where the music really diverges from Partch's scale, because of course the cloud chamber bowls, although they have a clear fundamental, they have even stronger overtones that are not in the scale.
And I have to say that was a magical moment in our rehearsing because the string players had to go stand by the bowls and tune
Pick up their
to the
notes.
bowls because those notes were not in the part scale. They're close, but I mean, talk about ears and facility, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
But something you just said reminded me, going back to John Cage, who said, "No, I don't hear something and then write. I write in order to hear."
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I think it goes both ways, actually,
Hmm.
for me. Yeah, it's a feedback thing.
I also was wondering, how did the string players tune? Did they just tune to like open Pythagorean tuning?
Yes.
Or
Yeah, they tune to pure fifths. They are the Del Sol Quartet are very experienced in just-intonation music, and in particular, Ben Johnston's quartets. When John and I first met in Pittsburgh at the Beyond Microtonal Festival in 2020, I believe they performed Johnston's 10th quartet live there.
That's right. That's right.
And I think they do, and I think that's a staple of their repertoire, but I think they do some of the other Johnston
They
quartets
also do
as well.
number 4. They do Amazing
Right.
Grace. Definitely. So.
Yeah, so they tune in open fifth, and in fact, are very adept with Johnston's notation. And so for a while, I thought that I would, and I'm not adept in Johnston's notation, but so for a while I had to, I was trying to write out the piece in his notation, and eventually they agreed that I could just use fraction notation, and it made sense to them still.
is fraction notation like you just write mostly normal notes and then you just write a fraction next to them just to say what it is?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so not hedgy.
No. No,
Yeah.
I have not. I have a lot of respect for Hedgie, but I find it for me to still be a barrier unless I'm. It's very the great thing about HEGI is that it is so adaptable, and it's sort of beyond what I need in a way.
No, I'll bet it was a really interesting challenge figuring out how to get the string players to play like harmonics and things correctly with the Partch scale and use those sorts of things together. Were there any notes that the string players had on harmonics that didn't come from the Partch scale that you used them for that particular purpose, or?
Yes. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, there was the moment. There's a moment towards the end where I mean the piece kind of has a progression also where it gets further and further from the G1/1 tonal center and then comes to it at the end. And so the penultimate section, which is the most kind of harmonically complex or irrational maybe, has these rolls in the cloud chamber rolls, and the strings are asked to match. They sort of build up to a dyads in each of the four string instruments where they're matching overtones in that are present in the rolling bowls. So each one has a bowl that they're kind of matching to, and so that's a section where the strings are asked. They actually told listen to harmonic bowl number 2 and match pitch, and I notated with cent deviations what the note that they should play is, but they had to, of course, do it connect by ear, and so that's the section where the strings really leave Partch's scale. But funnily enough, they're leaving Partch's scale to match with his instruments. Beyond that, I think there was a couple of times where I added, like a just seventh or a just perfect fifth to a harmony that wouldn't have been in Partch's scale, but very rare.
Which is exactly what Harry did all the time.
Which is what he would have done anyhow.
And he used to say, "I'm so sick of hearing 43. It's only a quarter part of a half truth. Sometimes I use many more than 43, and sometimes I use a lot fewer." So,
were there any particular challenges to playing the One-Footed Bride that you feel weren't present in pieces that are written by Partch, say?
not really, actually. I mean, Taylor's writing was very straightforward. The only challenge, again, was using the instruments in a slightly different way, because oftentimes, I mean, some of Harry's pieces, and we've had other people write for the harmonic canon, for example, and they go, "Oh, great, there's all these notes," and it makes it hellish to try to get, because all we have is 44 strings in front of us on every table zither, on every harmonic canon, and you have to look at the numbers as paint by the numbers. And if you have a lot of things happening very quickly, it's very difficult to play and to make it hit. And Taylor very wisely limited the notes and to replace a diversity of harmony or jumping around. He used really elegant changes and challenges in rhythms. So you'd have a limited number of notes you'd play, but so for our players, some of whom are not used to doing unusual rhythms, that was a challenge. And it was great because he allowed us to get into a groove and stay there long enough that we wouldn't get too crazy. I mean, Fernie Ho, it's not, right?
No, and I'd say I generally don't write grooves, but this piece has 2, and they're there because it's something that is in Partch's music. That's one thing that I wanted to, or rather, like you have in the for example, in the first section of Delusion of Fury, Exordium, he has this 11/8 groove that goes on for quite a lot of it, and so I tried to play off of those things a little bit, and but then also in terms of the difficulties of the instruments, I wanted to limit myself. I also wanted it to be very playable. And I can imagine, the harmonic canon. I mean, this is the first time I saw these instruments in person was one at the first rehearsal, but I've looked at lots of pictures of harmonic canon, and I'm just thinking like how I'm a guitarist. The people in the Partch ensemble are guitarists, pianists, percussionists for the most part. Am I going to be able to do this? What is idiomatic for this instrument? Sliding, sort of playing rhythmically on one string, so things that fit into the hand.
It was
So yeah,
interesting. There was also a whole both. No, I think it was just on the harmonic cannons. He asked for hammer dulcimer hammers to be used, which makes perfect sense until you realize that a hammer dulcimer, usually a note, it's like a piano. It's got three strings per note, and there's a huge gap between the three strings and the next set. The harmonic cannon, at least on my cannons, they are single strings per note, and they're a half inch away. And
Mm.
every hammer, dulcimer, hammer as they're known, has a very long, shallow angle. So it's very hard to go like that and just hit one string. And luckily, our players figured out a way to damp the other strings and be able to just hit the one that was open. So they had to learn a whole bunch of new techniques.
that's a good example of something that no matter how hard I tried, there are these things that don't really click until you see the instruments in person.
And we
Exactly.
also, a la Stephen Scott's bowed pianos, he wanted whole sections where it was bowed strings. Well, bowing a single note, I used an ebow on the electric guitar number 3, but we also had to make horsehair bows for the harmonic cannons and get a whole bunch and they have to be preset on particular notes and they need to be rosined up. And one of Taylor's great job, he'd come to a rehearsal and he'd be over in the corner rosining the
They're great.
horsehair.
Give me something to do instead of just feeling nervous. And rosin all the strings. Yeah. No, that ended up working very nicely, and yeah, I think the bowing, and now I'm working on an electronic piece for bowed guitar that I'm just sort of in this room in my free time.
Ah,
Yeah.
e-bowed or
No,
rosin
no,
bowed?
rosin bowed. It's acoustic guitar. Yeah.
Oh, nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Have a lot of other people written for the Partch ensemble? Is that common?
No. Basically, there's a very small group that have in the past. Anne LeBaron comes to mind. Matthew Rosenblum comes to mind. Uh, Again, Dean Drummond, very wisely, I mean, Dean wrote a bunch because he had the instruments in front of him and he knew what to do. He even created some of his own instruments. But we, just in the last few years, have started commissioning works. 2 years ago, we did a whole cycle of small pieces. And in fact, we've got 4 larger pieces in the works right now. Kyle Gann is just finishing a new piece for us. A gentleman, a Southern California composer named Jeffrey Holmes, whose music you might know, is working on a piece. So we're getting out there. But again, there's this big thing. You say, "Hey, you want to take the ride? Great. Well, you need to get a license to drive this truck. It's a
S-
specialist license."
Advanced composing, knowing the instruments, being idiomatic with everything. The Partch ensemble definitely seems like the epitome of that.
Pretty much, pretty
Yeah.
much. In fact, Ben Johnson, bless his heart, he lived with the instruments for almost a year up in Northern California when he was Harry Partch's assistant. And at the end of his life, I got to know him pretty well. I said, "So, Ben, would you write us a piece?" And he said, "Sure, I'd love to. When are you going to deliver the instruments?" Because he said, "There's no way I'm going to do it without them in front of me." And so that idea went, boom.
Oh,
Anne LeBaron, for example, who had written for Dean Drummond and has already written quite a lot of music for us, she's in the midst of finishing an opera whose original name was LSD, the opera. Now it's
yes.
LSD, Huxley's Last Trip, because Aldous Huxley features in it. Luckily, she lives in Southern California, and I actually delivered 7 or 8 instruments to her home for half a year. So she really got to hang out with him, and it's essential, really essential.
Yeah, that tactile feedback you get from being on an instrument and knowing how to write for it. I feel like especially in microtonality is really helpful. And then the Partch instruments just take it one level further where you have instrumental designs that aren't necessarily melodic. I think
Yeah.
the first instrument I encountered where the notes weren't just all in a row was the kalimba, where like
Mm.
you've got a note at the bottom and then the melody notes kind of alternate upwards. So it's a fun challenge orientation wise to get your brain used to. Well, Taylor, do you mind if we hop into the score for a bit? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
I'm really curious to see that section with the B down because I remember listening to that and thinking, oh, there's a dominant seventh thing going on, and then all of a sudden the sevenths just started to change and then like go through until they were kind of a major seventh, and I was like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen, and then everything started sliding, and it was just great.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen then. Open this up. All right, is it looking good on there?
Oh yes.
Okay, great.
Living
Oh, look at
black
all
and
that
white.
front matter.
Yes. So you can
Ooh.
see um the front matter is quite heavy in terms of notation, and I took Partch's notation tablature as much as I could. But of course, the instruments can all be tuned differently, and so you have to, say exactly what is tuned to what.
So some of the tablature is percussion clef.
Yes. And in fact, a lot of
Wow.
it is. I mean, it's tablature. It's there's no indication of pitch in the notation.
Right.
So the diamond marimba is a perfect example. I mean, so it the notation makes sense for the person playing the instrument, because it's how you see it.
Yeah.
But to know what pitches you get requires knowing the 11 limit tonality diamond, which is what the arrangement of the bars is. So in fact, John, as other composers write for your instruments, this might be a handy thing to send to them, because
Thank you. Of course.
this is also particular to some of your instruments.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll steal that from you.
Yes. Please feel free. Any more Partch instrument music. Sorry, but let's get to the actual music itself. So was there any section that you wanted to maybe look at?
I mean,
This is the section I was describing earlier.
Oh
where
yeah,
the piece starts in A.
You could describe how the 9/8 seems like a tonality, and then you really like thinking about 1/1 later, and then you kind of get to it, and it sounds like a tonic later.
Sure. Yeah. So the piece begins with the 9/8 as the tonal center. I make it very clear by just sort of repeating it over and over, and the harmony is often just an open fifth. So you can see it in the strings here. It's all A's plus the E, which is the perfect fifth. So the 27 to 16 to the 9/8 is a 3/2, right? It's a perfect fifth. And you'll see how difficult it is, because the chromelody B flat, well, that's an A, but that is, I believe that is an A up an octave in a major seventh from where that B flat's written. I might be wrong. It might be an octave below that. Then the diamond marimba strumming the 9/0, so the 9/0 tonality, which is basically the harmonic series of the 9/8. Spoils of War, that's, who knows what that is if you haven't studied
I do.
Yes. God knows, I know, a lot of people know. But that is in fact a large, I guess it'd be like a marimba bar that plays a 9/8.
That's an A 55 hertz.
Exactly.
The one single marimba bar that's on the spoils.
Yeah. Cathara, play the lowest of the set of 6 strings on the 4th set of strings, which is a 9/8.
Is that what the number 4 means on the Cathara 4th set of strings?
Correct.
Ah, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. And then the spaces are the 6 strings.
Yeah.
So the space below the staff is the lowest of the strings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Harmonic canon, 24th string. But I do notate the pitch for the harmonic canon.
Yeah.
And adapted guitar, you get to know what the pitch is for adapted guitar, which is wonderful.
Wow.
Well, hang on. You get to know the ratio.
You get to know the ratio. Well, but that is the pitch.
Yes.
As long as you know what the reference is, and it's always a G. So
of course.
Yeah. So if we look here at the 2 dyads, I wasn't thinking I want this precise harmony of 16/5 to 9/8 and 8/5 to 27/16. I was thinking I want this sort of crunchy approach interval of the minor second below the fifth, below the perceived tonic. That then leads to the resolution on the downbeat of the following bar, or sort of some sort of more clear consonance of returning to the 9/8. So here's a more interesting section for harmony. So Harry Partch, you can't make any. I feel you can't make any broad claims about how he wrote and organized his pitches, but I think one principle that is pervasive in his music from his entire output is thinking in terms of O tonalities and U tonalities. So for those who have a lot of familiarity with Genesis of Music or Harry Partch's music in general, you might have heard these terms, but O tonalities are overtone series, but that are based on different notes in the scale. I think O tonalities, it's the shared denominator in the fraction notation, and U tonalities shared numerator. So those are undertone series. I was similarly organizing many of my harmonies in O tonalities and U tonalities. And so you can see some of that here, where you have a 9 U tonality there for the most part, and sort of moving through this series of chords, 9/8 to 11/8, and that's sort of descending bass line. That then brings us eventually back to the 9/8 here, but it moves in these sort of small steps. So another principle I think in Harry Partch's music is that the 11 limit is the core. And then you have these other intervals that are kind of filler intervals. Even though the scale is uneven, it makes it a lot more even, because if you only have the 11 limit, then you have these huge gaps between the fifth and the notes around it, between the tonic and the notes around it, between all the sort of major polarities or the sort of most consonant notes of the scale. So he adds these filler notes. And so I also will often stick to these notes that are part of the 11 limit, especially when it comes to like a bass line. The idea is that I've established the 9/8 as the tonal center, and then I have this slowly descending bass line that goes from the 11/8 gradually down through several other intervals. You see here 5/4 down to 6/5 down to 7/6, and finally back to 9/8. And so I'm keeping this 9/8 as the perceived tonic, even though these intervals are referring to the G, and then sort of writing fairly thick harmonies, but they're all sort of with these root position chords that are happening. This is where the section begins. And so the cloud chamber bowl notation, it's actually quite a bit simpler than a lot of the other instruments. It's just, this is the third bowl, this is the fourth bowl, this is the seventh bowl. And here I found an error in my notation. This should be a percussion clef right here. Using the recordings that John sent of the particular cloud chamber bowls that Partch Ensemble has, because these bowls break very easily from what I understand. So you're sort of constantly having to replenish. And Harry Partch was having to constantly remake them as well. And so in different pieces, it's really different sets.
He would always just have to rewrite the bowl part. When one bowl would break, he would have a new bowl that he'd have to just make things work. It's very maddening. We thank heavens only had that happen once.
Yeah. And that would be really hard for this piece, because you see, is this large enough so you can read that? Plus 43 cents matched pitch from player 7's cloud chamber bowl. And so you have that plus 13 cents match the fifth. And so it starts with what are the perceived fundamentals of the bowls being doubled by the string quartet. And then, then they begin to start doing swells, and the swells are all matched. So each respective string player is moving with their matched bowl. And then as it goes, you get one of the overtones added. So plus 16 cents tuned to cloud chamber bowl overtone. And so this section, there was no, you could probably say, oh, this is close to this or that interval in just-intonation, but that the principle is just the sound of the timbre of the bowls.
If you were giving the ratios indicated by those cent deviations there, I assume they would look really nasty or complicated, maybe, or
Yeah.
it just would be a lot of work to calculate them all as well. Yeah.
The ratios would be pretty insane. But ironically, those bowls, it's usually a perfect tenth or a 10-4 over the fundamental. It's
Hmm.
amazing. It's just the way they're built.
But it's not a perfectly in tune
Of
tenth.
course not.
Yeah.
Because
So
the Pyrex glass itself has a different thickness for each one because they're manufactured slightly differently each one. It's just it's delightfully natural in
yeah.
that sense.
And then a few measures later, they discard the fundamental and they move up to and add a second overtone. So
Oh,
it sort
okay.
of moves up through the strings move up through the timbre of the bowl as it goes. And to me, I think is one of the more successful parts of the piece. And I think it's what makes the large scale form much more clear when I'm listening, where because you get to this place where you have these completely irrational harmonies. I mean, we all love the sound of these sort of rich inharmonic bells and glass instruments. And so it's building off of that, and I think for me there's also this sort of statement to be had there of that is, I think, a key part of Partch's ethos, which is to not strictly adhere to the system.
Think about those sections in U.S. Highball where he has it's this ridiculously carefully tuned chromolodion where every note is exactly in the scale. And then he plays these huge clusters and makes, train whistle sounds out of them. So
Yeah.
Classic Harry.
Those things, yeah.
irrational, as you say.
I heard a part in your piece that had something that sounded like someone speaking with all that clustering up and down, sort of imprecise feel. Is that a different section than this one?
Was it John literally speaking, or it sounded like someone speaking?
No, it sounded like someone speaking. It reminded me of what John was talking about. There was an instrument that was kind of going, and it sounded like it was a stringed
Oh,
instrument, I
yes.
think.
Those are the harmonic cannons. And in fact, that is let me go back to it. Here. So this is the same section, actually. Fascinating technique that I stole from John here. The slide that John uses to play the slide guitar with is the Pyrex bar. I mean, Partch's instruments are the Cathara is also used the Pyrex bar. If you turn it around so that the rough side, if I, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the rough side of the bar, if you sort of rub the strings with it, you get a kind of a bowed sound, but it's completely inharmonic. It's really a wild sound, and you're not quite sure what you're gonna get, but each time you do it. And so that's what I'm asking for here. And so you have sort of a rational harmony thing where you have the bowls, it's already this thick thing. And then adding this, it sneaks in. And then what you were just asking about, sliding up and down the harmonic cannons. So they're just strumming up and down the entire harmonic canon, which is something that you hear in Partch's pieces as well.
What's amazing in this case is that you've got two of the cannons that are tuned differently,
Yes.
doing it simultaneously.
And like the kalimba, it's not the lowest note always. So it goes up and down as it goes. And so that's one of the wonderful things actually about, again, I always go back to Delusion of the Fury because that's a piece I know. But he strums a set of the strings, not all of the strings. And it's like it is the basic, it's a leitmotif. You probably wouldn't want me to use that word, but it's a leitmotif of Delusion of the Fury. And it's basically strumming a minor triad, I believe, with a root of 16 over, or with a root of 9/5. But as you strum the strings, it's not just bottom to top. It creates sort of like an arpeggio that moves up and down as it goes. So you get that here, but of course it's combined with everything else in such a way that I'm just basically sort of piling on. So the section ends with, noise, essentially.
A
Kind of
great blurriness, which is
blurriness, yeah.
Then he follows it with go to the top of that system, Taylor, because then all of a sudden the harmonics on the adapted
Right.
guitar come through. So you go from this incredible blurriness to razor sharp ding, ding,
Yeah.
ding, ding, ding. Everything
Over the
snaps
same note
over a
in the
drone, exactly. And everything snaps into focus again.
Oh, that's that section where it drops out and then there's just this one really low note.
exactly the incredible sub bass of the reed organ chromelodion.
The
Yes.
foghorn.
Yeah, it's the chromelodion's just incredible. Okay, the other section that we talked about earlier, where they're doing the slight bends, the violins, that is sort of right towards the end. Yeah, in fact, this is probably the exact part you're talking about. And I got the intervals right too. So yeah, controlled bend, and you have it sort of between happening on different notes, kind of coloring the melody as it moves up.
Oh, and difference between 11 limit major third and the normal one. Oh, that's
Yep.
so cool. That's great.
Yeah. So it's
Mhm.
more about this sort of slightly high moving down gestural thing. It's ornamentational, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and knowing the Del Sol, I'll bet you they practice it with a tuner, got the sound in their ear, and then threw the tuning away, and were just able to produce it.
hmm The harmonies underpinning this section are very diatonic.
Right, yes. It has like that flavor where it sounds like diatonic JI, and then it's just got these few notes that are just poking out
Yep.
because they're a little, yeah. Like I recall the point at which the 11/8 enters is the part where the illusion is shattered that we were in diatonic land. Like we were getting
Yes.
up there, and then there's like a G chord that's normal, and then you've got that little 11/8 sneaking in, and you're like, oh, it's that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is there is, of course, with the Del Sol quartet and with using the string quartet in general in this context, I was also thinking about Ben Johnston.
Yeah.
And I love his string quartets. I mean, they're so varied, and yeah, each one is incredible. I believe it's the first movement of the seventh quartet that has these sort of quasi diatonic harmonies that then shift by a comma. It's either the seventh or the 10th. Anyway, I
No,
should
it's
know
the
this.
seventh. It's the
It
seventh.
is a seventh. Okay, great.
Yeah. It's incredibly complex.
Yeah, so I don't get as complex as that in this piece, but there's definitely a nod in Ben Johnston's direction.
His harmonies are not complex, but he's making them the way he's creating them. He's going through. I mean, I think Kyle Gann actually described it. He basically plays 1,200 different pitches throughout the entire quartet. It's just tiny, and they're perfectly in tune, and the harmonies are elegant, and the modulations are exquisite, and they're subliminal.
The drift, just-intonation, microtonal drift that is explored. I've always found that to be absolutely fascinating and just like incredible to listen to. So yeah, there's a little bit of that in here, and I wanted to run the full gamut from. I mean, this. Basically, there's a couple of sections where you just have a 1-5-4 harmonic progression that repeats a couple times. Think of like Neil Young's "Helpless" or kind of like "Knocking on Heaven's Door" by Bob Dylan. These songs that use this. I wanted to go to sort of run the gamut from something like that, which is harmonically very straightforward, but also very emotionally compelling, I'd find, just like as a chord progression, to the much more sort of complex, noisy stuff that we looked at just before. This is a section we were looking at earlier, or talked about earlier, where you have the 5/4 drone that is being held by all the instruments, and then the string quartet kind of play over top of it.
But also the opening has that slow da 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 da.
Oh, yeah.
Which is then recapped at the end.
Yes, yeah, and there's a few sort of melodies that recur. Yeah, but the end of the first section is what you're talking about, right? That's this part. That's the part we were talking about before, where you have the bass line going from 11/8 down to 9/8. So that is doubled in John's part.
Yeah,
John is carrying the
exactly.
bass line there or John playing the adapted guitar. And again, all of these notes, lowest to highest string on the guitar, but it's a misnomer. They're all the same pitch.
Right.
Yeah. So he's just has that note. And so he's doubling the cello there as the bass line descends.
Is the adapted guitar one, that one where they're all the same note, is it meant to play different notes? I mean, is that something that has been explored, like, having it all open as a drone note and then holding some other notes down, or I don't know how commonly that's done.
Partch never used it that way. I've used it in pieces, and so have other modern composers. He used it as a wonderful sort of, because of he loved the repetition of a single pitch. He would often have 22 of the 44 strings on a harmonica tuned to exactly the same pitch. So you could have this, and the slight tunings would make a chorusing effect. In terms of those notes, he used it a lot for melodies, and the sympathetic strings would add a sustain to it in such a way that just normally would not happen. So he used it more like like an ebow, actually.
This section I found here, so this is also one of these Ben Jonson inspired 1-5-4 progressions, but this begins on the 9/8, because here we're still sort of in that world transitioning to the 3/2 as the tonic center, I think, in the next section. But this melody is kind of that you have in violin 1 here. This is sort of a reoccurring theme that comes back in sort of different guises. So I was also playing a little bit with the idea of basically the harmonic situation, the same melody played with a different harmony around it. Yeah, this is reharmonization of this.
Notice also in the violin 1 part, for example, the first measure, second note, the G sharp, he says it's not, he tells the player it's going to be the 15/8 of the 9/8, rather than doing the math and giving this incredibly complex ratio. That's the way you hear it. You hear
That's
it.
so good. I wish more people did that. Can we make this a thing? Like, can we do that? We
Well,
should do that.
it only applies to a very
JI.
well, I guess it applies to maybe people in your audience. So, but yeah, I think, I mean, I just find it, I'm not, I'm envious of those in the JI community that have incredible math skills and theoretical skills behind what they're doing with pitch. But I'm kind of middling with that stuff. And so I try to do it how I hear it and how I think of it, which is, in this case, I think communicates well.
Yes, that's
Absolutely.
very effective. It reminds me of how secondary dominants are notated with Roman numerals.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
505 of.
Yeah.
Right. Just knowing like a core set of basic things that can then be extrapolated. Thinking of it in terms of those core things is so much more effective, I think, than working it out and then retroactively having it memorized.
And especially here, they've had the 9/8 drilled into their ears for the entire section.
Right, yeah.
So to hear it as in reference to the G would actually be a level of abstraction, to go back to that word. I'll mention that I do have a link to the score on the One-Footed Bride. The video and recording of the piece is available on Microfest's Vimeo, as well as on my personal YouTube channel. And in the description on the YouTube channel, as well as on my website, I do have a link to the score. So the score is available for anyone who wants to look at it.
Well, thanks so much for having this episode, you guys. I feel so honored to talk about this with both of you.
Well, yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure.
Yeah, great fun, guys. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The music you're hearing is from Taylor Brook's piece, One-Footed, named after Harry Partch's The One-Footed Bride. Please check it out. You can see it on YouTube and Vimeo, and the score is free to look at online on the Google Drive link. If you want to help us out, please leave our podcast a review on iTunes and spread the word. We try to release new episodes every once in a while. Get yourself subscribed so you won't miss any. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, or you can find our RSS feed at nowandzen.libsyn.com. Thanks once again to Taylor Brook and John Schneider for joining us, and for everybody for putting this piece together. We have a Patreon account, and when the Patreon account gets to 60 patrons, Now and Zen will go back to making episodes monthly. This episode is made possible by the generous support of our patrons, our Zen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Zen Harmonic gods, Mike Battaglia, Sheldon Bird, Adam Freese, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Cicarella, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joel Weigel, and Tina Harmon-Carteau. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you next time on Now and Zen. The movement you are listening to in One-Footed is the last part of the final movement, Movement 7, Power.
Listening is not the same as hearing. And hearing is not the same as listening.